Hello everybody and welcome to Forever Red Devil. This is your latest Manchester United news, and what a week we've had for United. We've had a pretty groundbreaking interview from Sir Jim Ratcliffe with Gary Neville explaining the horrors of the financial reality of Manchester United, as well as trying to justify and explain some of the big sort of budget cuts that Ineos are currently making. And a day later, we had an unveilment of the new stadium, which started to maybe sort of come around to, I think the main thing is obviously looking at what it's actually going to look like once it's finished. And, you can look at the artist impressions and the cool videos and the models and the likes of that. It all comes down to what it looks like in the flesh and where they managed to really sort of deliver on the vision they are presenting. But a lot to get through today. Coming up in the show, we were talking about that interview with Sir Jim Ratcliffe, and he speaks a bit about Ten Hag and the sort of the sacking process and what Ruben Amorim's doing at the moment. He speaks a little bit about financial realities of where we are. And then we sort of speak about the stadium, the £2 billion stadium that we're going to start constructing and hoping to move in it looks like the 2030-2031 season. So they're hoping to try and build a stadium within 5-6 years, as opposed to sort of the 10 years that we expect to build a stadium of this kind of magnitude. And the big thing I want to talk about is the Glazers and the fact that they've kind of become the perfect situation for them, in that they kind of just sort of sit behind the scenes and everybody kind of sort of slowly forgetting about them, and how important it is for United fans not to forget about them and to continue making sure that we push to get them out the club and to make sure that we move towards an ownership who are the right type of people and are making the right decision at United. And I think Sir Jim Ratcliffe's even admitted that they've made a lot of wrong decisions since coming on board. And one of that being Eric Ten Hag and the new contract, for example, and kind of the way it all sort of went down with regards to the extension of the contract, then having to sack him and spending £15 million in paying off people who come in and then had to leave. So yeah, let's start with the interview, shall we? So Gary Neville sat down with Sir Jim Ratcliffe and the interview came out in the overlap, and I really, really advise you go and watch it. Very interesting interview, and quite difficult to sort of say how I feel about it, because I think at some points I felt Gary Neville was very good in terms of calling out certain things and talking about some of the cost cutting that's happening, for example, and wondering why we got to the situation, and he also, I think, questioned the footballing decisions and sitting there saying it's worrying that the people in charge, the team he's got around him, aren't thinking about certain things, are not managing to get other things sorted and making the wrong mistakes. There's mistakes is always going to happen. When I say the wrong mistakes, mistakes where you cannot make, mistakes where it's completely decimates the club, really. It's completely unacceptable. And this is kind of where we're at with Ineos. And this is the problem. I think a lot of the fans remain very skeptical of Ineos because of the budget cuts, and but I think the reality is when Jim Ratcliffe was talking about the fact that there's no more money at United. That they put in £300 million, and basically United was set to sort of run out of cash in November this year, and that is still a reality unless they continue to cut back. And then a day later, we announced a £2 billion stadium, which will mean more loans, probably low interest loans, but it will mean more loans, more investment. And we're struggling to see as a club, Omar Beretta keeps coming out and saying that they want to be the most profitable club in the world in the next 3 years. While, you kind of say, well, we're going to have £1 billion in debt, £2 billion stadium to come up. How is that going to happen? And my biggest thing, what worries me about the interview with Jim Ratcliffe is, first of all, how badly you say United are in, the financial reality, and you listen to some of the staff cuts, and some of it was ludicrous. He talked about the fact that there was a consultant who was a body language specialist and paying only £170,000 a year type of thing. So I do think that there was always going to have to be, in the words of Ralph Rangnick, open heart surgery, and we were always going to have to look at where we were needlessly spending money. But as Gary Neville says, you look at the wages the players are earning, and that's somewhere we need to sort of cut down. And so Jim Ratcliffe, I'm not entirely sure I'm a massive fan of it, spoke about the fact that they're still having to pay for players that they themselves did not buy. Rasmus Højlund, Anthony, Jadon Sancho, Casemiro, all these sort of players that they did not buy because they were bought before, and they're still having to pay transfer fees, I think in the sum of like 50, 60 million pounds for these players that they themselves did not sign, maybe even did not want to sign. And that's going to continue to sort of haunt Ineos as they could try and press reset on a club that has got so much debt to try and pay, so many commitments, and it's just absolutely nowhere. And you kind of wonder, well, where do they find that equilibrium between resetting and managing to sort of get going with things, as well as remaining financially stringent. And the big worry at the moment with the new stadium is how it's going to affect the squad. So the big thing I want to talk about with the interview with Jim Ratcliffe is that Gary Neville said, you get to a boardroom and you've got all this money, you've got certain parties who've not invested anything in the club for well over a decade. They're taking a lot of money out the club. And, is there a situation where you're sitting there saying, well, when do you start making money? And so Jim Ratcliffe basically kind of sidestepped that. And he said, well, that's not sustainable. We can't just keep putting in money and keep sort of bailing out. But that's not the point. The point is we've got co-owners in this club in the form of the Glazers, and you need to call them as they is, because that's what they didn't name in the interview. And I understand Gary Neville's involved. So it's difficult for him to come out and say the Glazers themselves. But you've got owners in the club who have just ransacked the club. That's the only way to describe it. They've ransacked the club. They've taken all the money out that they can. They've invested no money into it. Even the leveraged buyout, plunging us into debt. And now, even if Ineos are the good guy owners who are putting money into the club and the likes of that, all they're doing is painting over the Glazer cracks. And until we see the Glazers leave Manchester United, sell up and ship off, we as fans have got to continue the protesting. We've got to continue putting pressure on the United structure, because we as a club will never move forward whilst the Glazers are still involved. They represent everything bad that's happened to United. They represent the implosion of the greatest club in the world into what we are at the moment. And for as long as they sit around that boardroom and they even have a hundredth of a say in what happens at the club, we will not progress as a club. Even if Ineos have got the right ideas, even if Ineos are ready to put in the money and to back the manager and likes that, as long as the Glazers are there, it's a farce. And all the moment, we're seeing is and you talk about the PR spin. Well, that's the thing, pressure's mounting. We're so broke, financial disaster. We've got no money in the transfer window. Ruben Amorim's not getting the results, and the pressure was building once again. From for example, the 1958 Supporters Trust are going after them, and everyone's really sort of starting to feel that enough's enough. So what do? We throw out a fancy new stadium. And now everyone's talking about the stadium, and some people are saying it's absolutely phenomenal, and it's going to have the whole the pitchfork from the devil and the trident of those three towers, and it's going to be 100,000 seater, and we're going to have one of the most state of the art stadiums in the world, and everybody suddenly gets excited, and we start to shift away from the things that we should really be concentrating about, which is the fact that the Glazers continue to be a part of this club, and that can't happen. The big thing at the moment is that we don't want a new stadium right now. We don't want even, to be honest, I think if you ask a Man United fan right now, what would you take, a Premier League or the Glazers out? We actually want the Glazers out. We want that more than we want trophies right now, because it's about rebuilding a club that can be successful long term. Not just about burgling a few trophies here and there. Obviously, we'd love to have trophies, and it's so important that we get the Europa Trophy this season from a financial point of view, even more from a trophy point of view. But until we get the Glazers out, until we start rebuilding our club from the bottom up, we get the structures right, where we can go back to being competitive every single season, United fans are not going to be happy. We don't want the fluke, COVID Premier League that Liverpool won. This is now the league that Liverpool fans are going to celebrate, because now they're seeing a side which is sustainable, a side that's sustainably been competitive, been building up, and now they're walking the Premier League. We don't want to burgle a one-sort league and then going back to being non-competitive for years and years. We want to get back to the situation where we were 20 years ago, where every single season we started off as a top three, favourite to win the Premier League. That's what a Real Madrid is. Real Madrid go into every single season thinking we are going to win the La Liga. And if we don't, that's where managers get sacked, players get sold, the likes of that. And that's what we want. We don't want to go back to winning a few cups in here. We need to become a world-class club that is always challenging for the Premier League, always challenging for the Champions League, and always competitive. And we're just so far away from that. And that's why I say, as long as the Glazers are involved, we're never going to progress. We're never going to become a club like that until we get the structures right, until we get the ownership right, and we start to make decisions worthy of the badge of Manchester United, which is not happening at the moment. And as supporters, all we can do is continue to put pressure on on the ownership. Whether it's protests, whether it's boycotts, whether it's engaging with them through the National Supporters Trust, through Must. It's making sure that they are uncomfortable and making sure that we will not be seduced by a fancy new stadium. We're not going to be seduced by a burgled FA Cup and the likes of that. We know what we need to do as a club. But that's the thing. All the supporters know. We know what we want. We kind of know what we're doing wrong. And these days, supporters are more informed than ever before. Some of them. You go on football Twitter and you kind of think maybe not as much. But you can dive into the financials. You can dive into how it works. You can look at the right case studies. You can look at how well run a Brighton is, for example, and how well run Nottingham Forest have been in the last few years, and how that sort of genuinely made them go on a bit of a Premier League run. And you can look at how well certain takeovers have worked out. You can look at Newcastle in the final this weekend. You can look at how well run certain German clubs are, and even at Real Madrid, and how they consistently manage to be so competitive. It's not an ill-informed fan base. All the facts are there. All the information is there. We know what you are doing wrong. We know what you are doing. Full stop. We know when the Glazers take your money out. Back in the day, you could have gotten away with that sort of thing, and even when they took over, there was a lot of protest. But fast forward, almost 20 years, all that information of just exactly what you're taking out on a yearly basis made public, and you can publicly scrutinize and see immediately just how much they have ransacked this club. And that's why, as fans, we've got to make sure that there is pressure being put on the club at all times to make genuine steps forward, to go and get rid of the Glazers who, don't care about the club and just want to try and suck every last penny out of it. Even now, the cost-cutting measures, there's a massive, massive microscope on what the financials will look like next year. It's one thing to do all the cost-cutting, but where are we going to see it? If, for example, we see all this cost-cutting and we don't see debt coming down, we don't see investment of the cost-cutting, then what was the point? You're sacking all these members of staff, you're taking away lunches, you're taking away all these different savings, which is fine as long as it's going into the right place. And we will know and we will see exactly in a year's time what the difference has been. And if it's not going into the right place, well, then what was the point? Because that's the big worry at the moment, is that we're making all these cost-cutting just so the Glazers can take a bigger dividend. And that the money goes back to the wrong people, as opposed to going back into the club and to trying to bring down the debt so we can actually free up actual funds, especially within the financial regulations, to be able to go and build a proper squad. Now, what was quite interesting in comparison is that Sir Jim Ratcliffe, in trying to defend Ruben Amorim, spoke about the fact that the current squad he's working with, wage bill, is actually closer to Everton than it is to Manchester City, given the fact that there's no Anthony, there's no Sancho, there's no Rashford, there's no Luke Shaw, there's no Mason Mount, and because of the injury and the likes of that. But it was a very weird comparison to make, because these players are not been sold. We're not offloaded their salaries. I mean, some of them are complete disaster moves. He talked about the fact that Jadon Sancho is not even at the club anymore and costing us half salary, half his wages every single week we're having to pay. And we've got to bring that salary cap down a lot. You've got to sell Sancho, sell Rashford, sell Casemiro, and that in itself is going to give you a saving of, I think, about £750,000 a week. That's £3 million a month. So it's a £30 million saving if you sold those three players. That's kind of the big decision we have to start making now. Because 30 million is tangible. That is actual money you can see going into a signing, for example, or wages for other players you need to try and tie down. But you've got to offload the big earners, and you've got to try and make sure that something like a dog, I think, is on £100,000. That is a good contract. He's 20 years old, he's young. That will go up as he starts to earn it, but he will need to earn it. But he's locked down for a long time on a decent, palatable wage that we can actually sort of get behind, and we're not going to sit there saying that he's costing us a ludicrous amount. So we've got to start offloading a lot of players, and the main thing is the supporters. We need to make sure, and we need to see that all these savings and all this money that we're sort of trying to sort of reallocate are going into the right places. Bring the debt down. Majority of clubs around the world in the Premier League do have debt. Everybody has debt, and there's a certain they talk about the fact there's a certain amount of good debt, inverted commas, and how it can empower your borrowing capacity and the likes of that. But at the moment, we've just got crippling debt, and we've got to get rid of our crippling debt. We've got to get rid of the fact that we paid over £1 billion on interest. that's half our stadium on interest. And these are the things, when you make those sort of comparisons, we kind of realize just how shocking the situation is, because we've spent so much stupidly ludicrous amount of money on the leverage buyout that we're paying for 20 odd years later and nowhere near paying off. Let's talk about the stadium, shall we? So we've got this Circus 10T Trident's fancy thing, and it's going to cost us £2 billion. And I thought we'd do a bit of a fact check. So, very importantly, people talking about the fact the government are going to pay for the stadium. The government is not paying for the stadium. They've actually not really spoken about how the stadium is going to get paid, but United will pay for the stadium, or any else investment or borrowing the likes of that. But Jim Ratcliffe basically said that the start of the work of the stadium and when we can get going heavily relies on the rejuvenation project of the sort of greater Old Trafford area. Now, that is being funded by the government. So, very important sort of clarification. The government is not paying for the stadium. The government is paying for the rejuvenation of the area around, of which the stadium will then become a part of. And we've seen this a lot with Manchester City, who invest a lot into that. Now, Jim Ratcliffe basically said quite flippantly, he said we can't afford to regenerate Southern Manchester. It is too big a bill for the club. He said we don't need any government funding for the stadium, but it has to be the underpin for the regeneration. So it is a collaboration. Basically the government's going to sort of work on things like the train station and the infrastructure around the stadium and kind of rejuvenate South Manchester, which will then allow us to be able to build the stadium within the precinct and deliver the various different sort of world-class facilities and experiences we want to deliver. In terms of the cost, they're working about £2 billion. And the sad thing is that the reality is that Old Trafford is going to get knocked down. You look at the plans, they don't seem to have any sort of room for Old Trafford to remain, even if it was sort of be to maybe reduced to a smaller stadium likes of that. And it's going to be very interesting because there were talks yesterday about how the Stretford Inn is going to increase in size. Are we going to see the Sir Alex Ferguson stand, for example, the Sir Bobby Charlton stand, and the Stretford Inn and the likes of that? So one would imagine we are, but that's, I think, a lot of the heritage that people are talking about losing, in that this Old Trafford has continuously been revamped. So the essence of the stadium has always kind of remained the same, even though it's a completely different stadium to what it was when it was Newton and Heath back in the 1800s. But now we're going to completely move from this stadium to a new stadium, and we're going to lose a lot of history in that. That's the big complaint. Now, the reality is that Old Trafford is archaic. It hasn't changed. I've been there before, and it's very much a sort of late 50s type of stadium. Big, you've got big walkways, but not much room to work with, and it's a very, very simple layout of the stadium. And you see the modern stadiums. I was in Lyon and went to the Group Palmer Stadium there. It was phenomenal. Escalators going up to sort of your middle divisions. Massive walkways, the stadium experience itself, the seats, there's Wi-Fi in the stadium. It was a whole different experience. And you think of that as, well, this is what surely one of the biggest clubs in the world has, and we don't have that. And you've got to, to a certain degree, be able to bench, your love for just the past. We've got to be able to be realistic and just say, well, we've got to have a modern stadium. We need to have something that fits the bill of the best club in the world. And it's a bit of a tricky situation, because there's a big concern that with the new stadium, you're going to be an emphasis on selling, to international tourists and the likes of that, to international fans, and they're going to kind of lose that local feel. And there's a big mounting rhetoric at the moment that's where the atmosphere has gone. That you've got these sort of tourist fans who come in and watch, and they don't really add to the atmosphere. That your local fans who come in week out, there's a massive waiting list for season tickets, and yet all indications are, despite the fact there's going to be 27,000 new seats, the season ticket allocation is not going to go up, and instead they can sell to your tourist fans and the likes of that, and at a higher ticket price, and sort of price out your locals who are a key part of the club and the like of that. So there's a lot of stuff over there in that regard that the club's going to have to try and navigate and try and get right. And there's no real easy answer, because United are an internationally acclaimed club. There's no doubt about that. And it's become the size of it is because of that international support. That's why it is as big as it is. And the reality is, if you cut off your international fan base, you cut off all the money. You look at the sponsors, for example; they're not British sponsors that United have got, and you look where the money comes from. When you go and travel in the off season, you're playing all these leagues in the US and these friendlies in Qatar, stuff like that. So much funding comes from outside the UK. So you can't just become we're just an English club and that's all we are going to be. You have to embrace the internationalism of what United is, because that is a key pillar that it was built on. Yes, back in the day it was built on, the working class needing a football team and growing, etc., etc. That's not the case at the moment. Now it is a global conglomerate, really, and it's listed on the US stock exchange. It's got headquarters in the US, so it's a tough one where you want to make sure it's still a stadium with people and a club for the people, but incorporates that international flavor that makes it the biggest club in the world. So that's pretty much, sort of the main things that have happened the last couple of days. Other very interesting sort of news. Obviously, we've got big match tomorrow in the Europa. We will have Ruben Amorim's press conference a bit later, so hopefully he'll be able to tell us what the kind of the injury update is. Not looking particularly good, and we've got to win tomorrow night. There's no other way of putting it. A loss tomorrow night means our season is over. There's nothing to play for. We lose tomorrow night, the season's done. The Premier League is nothing to play for anymore. The season becomes a literal going through the motion situation. We basically can't get relegated. We're sitting 17 points ahead of Ipswich, who even them, they'd have to go on a proper run to try and avoid relegation. So we're not going to climb up the table. We're sitting 17 points over there. We're sitting, 12, I think it's 15 points behind fourth. So there's no chance of us getting a top four, the likes of that. We're not going to get relegated. We lose the Europa League clash tomorrow, the season is over. That's the reality. And Ruben Amorim speaking about the fact that winning the trophy is the biggest thing in the season. I get what he's trying to say in terms of there's so much more we need to try and fix, but it is. That the season is the Europa. Everything is all about the Europa. Because of winning the Europa, first of all, even apart from the trophy, it's the financial gain that we're going to get from winning the Europa. That's far more important than the trophy itself. But let me know what you think about the whole thing, and what your stands on the stadium and stuff like that down in the comments below. Smash a like on the video, subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Steve.